Welcome to the Climate Story podcast. In this episode of Climate Story, I sat down with Dr. Mathew Hampshire-Waugh. I met Matthew at his home in Essex to better understand the link between the energy crisis, cost of living, and climate change. Matthew is the author of a well-researched book called Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero.
Do the maths, look at how this technological change is happening with wind, solar, batteries, what have you. So you come to this conclusion that it's not a trade-off between economy and environment. It's a win-win for both economy and environment.
I'm Rishad Mehta, the founder of Climate Story, a platform featuring the most important voices in climate science, sustainability, and conservation. Let's dive right in. Yeah, it feels good to finally do this. I feel like it's been a while. We've been talking for a couple of months now, trying to figure out schedules and stuff, but really happy to finally sit down and pick your brain.
Yep.
Ask you some super annoying questions.
You go for it.
Luckily, you know everything already, so it's...
Well, there's no, you know the rule, there's no stupid question. There's only stupid answers.
And a stupid questioner. Awesome. I kind of want to start at the end today. So at the end of your book, you say, may the foxes become hedgehogs and the hedgehogs a little more fox. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is kind of a concept in sort of sociology or psychology, whereby foxes are known to be cunning. They can hold many ideas at once. They will interchange between ideas and they will adapt. So you can put people in the camp of being foxes. You can also put people in the camp of being hedgehogs. So hedgehogs have one big idea, and that one big idea fits everything, and everything fits into that mold, and they hammer home that idea. One's not necessarily better than the other, but as humans, we tend to listen to hedgehogs more. Because hedgehogs have one simple idea, and it's a lot easier to latch onto one simple idea.
But they also tend to be like very narrow in their thinking, right?
Very narrow in their thinking, not open to new ideas or to changing course if the data comes their way. Versus a fox who will adapt.
Right.
And if you look at studies on this in predicting and forecasting the future, then actually foxes get it right a lot more often. The point is that we kind of, I want this climate rapper to be the cunning and the cleverness and the adaptability of a fox.
Yeah.
Because, sitting here today, we know we want to get to zero emissions by the middle of this century.
Yeah.
We broadly have an idea of how we do that. We're going to talk about that today. But we're not going to have it perfectly correct because nobody can exactly forecast the future. So we need to be adaptable, flexible. We need to be cunning.
For sure.
But we need to wrap it up in one strong idea, one strong message, so we can hammer home that message and get everybody on board.
So what's that message coming from you?
That message from, look, and I think over the course of maybe the last 5 years, the message is really centered around net zero.
Yeah.
That word net zero, right? We need to be net zero emissions by the middle of this century to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
What's climate change? I guess
a change.
I guess that's a good question.
So, winding back, what's climate change? Well, it's exactly what it says. It's a changing climate. So maybe it used to be called global warming. So we are, through our activities in the economy, humans are burning fossil fuels. Yep. We're also releasing other greenhouse gases from industrial or agricultural processes. Those are going up into the atmosphere and they are accumulating in the atmosphere. So every year we're adding more and more.
Yep.
A little bit gets drawn back down by Earth systems, such as the oceans and the forests, but about half of it stays up there in the atmosphere.
Right.
And these greenhouse gases are building up and building up and building up in our atmosphere. And the more there are, essentially the thicker a blanket there is around the Earth, the more energy gets trapped. And for Earth to rebalance its system, it has to warm the lower atmosphere where we live.
Which is a natural process, right?
it is a natural process, and it's happened for hundreds of millions
Yeah.
of years, right? So scientists can now trace this back for 500 million years.
Wow.
So they can look at ice core, little bubbles of past air trapped in ice cores. They can look at things like rings on trees. They can look at structures in the ocean and date them and look at the past atmosphere through sort of proxy measures. And they can plot what the concentration of CO2 was in the atmosphere for about 500 million years now.
Yeah.
And they can do the same for temperature.
Yeah.
What was the average temperature of the Earth through that period?
Fair.
And you'll see for 500 million years, one pretty much exactly tracks the other.
You mean heating and cooling of the Earth?
So more CO2,
Yeah.
more temperature. Less CO2, less temperature.
And that's a cycle that's been going on basically for eternity.
Yeah, well, for the history of the Earth.
Yeah.
And
so what's different this time? Like, why is it now an issue that these temperatures are rising?
Yeah, so I mean, and first we should say that it's not necessarily that CO2 goes first and temperature follows. Sometimes temperature goes first and CO2 follows.
Okay.
There's all sorts of different feedback mechanisms in the Earth. But if one moves, the other goes after it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, through the history of the Earth, you can go back millions of years when CO2 was 2 or 3 times higher than it is today.
And what were conditions like in those days?
So temperatures would have been, so we're talking the dinosaurs here.
Yeah.
So temperatures would have been 10 degrees C hotter. Oceans would have been a couple of 100 meters higher. And so, you would have the tropics just spreading north and south towards the equators of the Earth. And then all of that cooled. So over millions and millions of years, the whole Earth cooled down. And we entered more recently, in terms of millions of years, rather than tens or hundreds of million years, ice ages.
Yeah.
So again, the ice would have spread over sort of 2/3 of the Earth's surface.
Yeah. And that was a great movie, right?
Yeah. What was that, 2012 or something? Yeah.
Great movie.
So it didn't quite happen that quickly. It didn't happen overnight.
Fair enough. Yeah.
These are geological timescales.
Fair enough.
This is a long time. This is millions of years. But yeah, we went through these ice ages where the Earth's land was mostly covered in ice.
Yeah.
And you asked originally what's different today. We've been through this in the past. Well, Earth's been through it in the past because humans have only been around a few million years.
Yeah.
And modern humans have only been around for a heartbeat.
Yeah.
In terms of the Earth's
what is it,
geological
like 12,000 years or something like that?
Yeah, well, 12,000 years ago, we started the agricultural revolution. So we went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers with no fixed abode to realizing and developing enough sort of knowledge and tools and learning that we could actually stay in one place and we could tend the land and we could grow crops.
Yeah.
And that was a game changer because once you can stay in one place, you can start to accumulate goods.
Yep.
You can start to build houses. And once you start doing that, you start improving productivity.
Yep.
And you start to have to spend less time hunter-gathering or less time farming. And there's more time for other stuff, right? Building culture, building knowledge, building science.
These people, these civilizations, like, were they comfortable? Did they have enough resources? Like, I'm alluding to the first chapter of your book where you talk about the Malthusian trap. Exactly.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. That's an interesting one.
Well done on reading the book. You got through chapter 1.
Most of it. Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So what I know so far is that you skip straight to the end.
Exactly. And the beginning.
And then you got to chapter 1.
We have to see if there's anything in the center. Yeah.
Is there anything in the middle?
We have time. Yeah.
No, so the Malthusian trap. Well, we're jumping about a bit here, but that's so Thomas Robert Malthus was a sort of 18th century scholar, and he was really the world's first actuary. So he was interested in how populations grow and shrink and the resources that they consume. And he was the original doomster.
Right.
So he thought we were all doomed.
Yeah.
Because every time we learned to do something a little bit better or improve productivity, create more food, create more resources, that was kind of linear. And then he saw the population swell and grow
Yeah.
exponentially. So
Yeah.
it would shoot up, more mouths to feed.
Yeah.
And through one form or the other, whether it be disease or starvation or war, that we would inevitably end up in the same sort of quality of life or suffering
Sure.
or scenario
Yeah.
as we were before, despite those productivity improvements.
Because our rate of population increase equal the rate of progress. So-
Yeah, as soon as you get some progress, population just shoots up, and on average per person,
Yeah.
you have the same quality of life.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And there's an economic historian called Angus Maddison who did a lot of work charting sort of income per person, basically, back as far as he could through history.
Yeah.
So he went back about 2,000 years. And pretty much for the last 2,000 years, humans have been stuck at roughly the same level of income, at about $1,000 per year. Of course, that might not be money. That's the equivalent of goods and services.
Sure.
Then more recently, money. But yes, we were kind of stuck in this Malthusian trap. And really, we've only very recently broken free of it. And that was about 200 years ago. And that was essentially with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So we learned to harness coal, then oil, then gas.
Yeah.
And we learned to unlock the vast energy stores of these fossil fuels.
Yep.
And something like, 1 barrel of oil is the equivalent of about 10 years of human labor in energy
Amazing.
terms.
Yeah.
So suddenly we've got all of this energy, and we've learned to harness it and release it and improve human productivity.
Yeah.
And labor.
Yep.
And do things better and faster and make more of them. And
it's even good in a way, right? Because I guess before people used oil and gas, they were probably burning wood to like heat their homes or cook with.
Yep.
So in a sense, oil and gas was a step up at that level, at that scale, before it became like industrialized.
Yes, absolutely. So, we used to, it was biofuels, burning wood. That was the main energy source. And then a little bit of, windmills, damming rivers.
Right.
But there was no big step up in the amount of energy that we could harness until we started digging coal, oil, and gas out of the ground.
Yeah.
And since we started doing that over the last sort of 200 years, your average income per person in the world has gone from about $1,000 to about $18,000.
Yeah.
So an 18-fold increase.
That's a pretty good raise. Yeah.
That's pretty good, right?
That's pretty good. Yeah.
And yeah, as you point out, we now have we have all of these different energy solutions.
Yep.
We're not just stuck burning wood.
So so that's great. So we should be thanking the oil companies and saying, thank you so much. You've made life good.
Yeah.
Because they have in a sense, right?
By most measures,
Yeah.
life today, quality of life for your average human being is far better than it was 200 years ago.
Yeah.
If you look at extreme poverty, it's been reduced 80, 90%.
Yeah.
Life expectancy has gone from sort of circa 40 years to 70 years. Deaths on the battlefield are dramatically decreased. So by education has massively improved. So all of these sort of social measures of quality of life have undoubtedly improved. And that is because of fossil fuels. Yes, absolutely. The problem is now we've got to a point where that productivity increase has given us that time to build knowledge, to record that knowledge, to create science, art, culture. And a culmination of that has been that now scientists understand that burning those fossil fuels means that we're adding those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's raising the temperature of the Earth. So we've already gone from about 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
To well over 400 parts per million.
Okay.
And
I'm assuming that's not good.
well, that so far has raised the average temperature by well over 1 degree C.
Yeah.
And that's the average temperature. So that's across both land and ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to remember that land will actually warm about 2 times faster than the average. Cities will be maybe 2 or 3 times faster than the average.
Right.
The ocean will warm a bit slower than the average.
Yeah.
So averages don't paint the full picture.
Yeah.
And what is that doing? Well, it's creating more extreme weather.
Mm-hmm.
So you put more energy into a system. We're trapping that energy in the Earth system. That creates more extreme weather.
Yep.
So storms, flooding, you're talking more intense hurricanes. And it's also creating more drought.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hotter, you get more evaporation, the soil will dry out more. Actually, rainy areas get rainier, but dry areas get drier, as a general rule of thumb.
Which makes it hard for everyone, right?
Which is harder, because when it does rain, it rains really hard, and you get flooding and runoff, and you don't replenish your water reserves,
so it's
your soil.
Extreme weather events that are being caused by the the rapid increase in warming, I should say.
And then you've of course got things like forests drying out, to enhanced risk of forest fires, which can spread further.
Yeah,
you have more heat extremes. So in finance, you would call it tail risk. So again, averages don't paint the full picture, because not only have on average temperatures got hotter by about 1 degree C, but there's a sort of distribution of events around that. And it's actually got broader. So very hot events are very much more likely. And they don't go up proportionally, they go up exponentially. So I'm talking heat waves, which I think we've all experienced, over the recent summers. So there's a multitude of problems that a warming climate causes. And then there's, of course, knock-on effects of that. By the middle of this century, it's going to be extremely detrimental to agricultural yields, because you're getting all of this drought, more unpredictable weather, and that makes it harder to grow crops as effectively. Yeah,
I mean, the Londoners are definitely suffering the tomato shortages.
Well, that is an example.
I'm joking, but
you're joking, totally, but that has been caused by extreme weather in Spain, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, fair enough.
And that's killed the tomato harvest. And so, agriculture is an issue. Availability of water is an issue, because of course you get more
clean
droughts.
Water,
clean water,
drinking water.
But also when you get more flooding and storm surges, because of that extreme weather at sea, but also because sea levels are increasing. So as temperature goes up, water expands, ice on land melts into the ocean, and this is causing the sea levels to rise. So they've risen by about 20 centimeters so far.
Which doesn't sound like much.
It doesn't sound like much. And by the end of this century, it's predicted to be about 0.5 meter to 1 meter. But if you think about that, again, that's the average. You then add a storm to that,
right?
And suddenly you're breaking through tidal barriers, and you're
we don't have the infrastructure.
You don't have the infrastructure to deal with that, and you're also mixing salt water with clean water. So again, you're in another way destroying clean water sources. So hunger becomes an issue. Availability of water for both humans, agriculture, and industry becomes a big issue. And then the destruction of capital goods or infrastructure, of course. So all of this extreme weather and all of these heat problems or fires are, of course, going to destroy power lines, roads, industrial infrastructure. And the knock-on effect of that is to create disruption and destroy incomes basically and reduce GDP or gross domestic.
So that 18,000 average income that we've now been able to achieve, do you think that's going to go down over the next century because of all these threats to our infrastructure?
I think we are now starting to address climate change. We are waking up to these issues, right?
Just about, yeah.
And we have a number of paths ahead of us. So just to give you an idea, if we do very little from where we are today, we, by the end of this century, the average temperature increase will be about 3 degrees C.
Right.
If we reach net zero and we eliminate carbon emissions by 2050, by the middle of this century, then we've got a good chance of limiting average global warming to about 1.5 degrees
Haven't
C.
we already crossed that though? Like, aren't we already past 1.5?
We've already locked in more warming.
Yeah.
So we're at about 1.1, 1.2 now. Because the Earth system takes maybe a decade or so in the near term to catch up to what's been added to the atmosphere, and actually centuries to fully equilibrate.
So we're probably already close to 1.5, right?
We're already close to sort of 1.4 probably. And again, this stuff isn't precise. So, you know, there are a number of ranges that you have to look at to understand the probable outcomes. But if we get to net zero, you know, that clear message is and has to be, if we get to net zero by the middle of this century, there's a good chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C.
What do you mean by net zero? Does that mean that nobody can ever emit a single molecule of carbon? Like, what's your definition of net zero?
Yeah, net zero means either you don't emit any greenhouse gases, not just CO2.
Okay.
But there's other greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
Or what you do emit, you then suck back out of the atmosphere.
Right. And we'll get to that. Yeah.
Because there are lots of carbon is exchanged with the Earth's forests and oceans on a huge scale. Every year, it's a continual process, and human emissions are just a fraction of that. The problem is that human emissions have no natural counterbalance. So for the last 10, 12,000 years through the agricultural revolution, we've had a very stable climate because CO2 has been very stable in the atmosphere because the natural systems have put as much CO2 into the atmosphere as they've drawn back out. So it's just held it at a steady state. Yeah. And that's mean we've had pretty predictable weather, pretty predictable climate. What we're doing now is, human emissions may be only 1/10 of what natural systems add to the atmosphere, but there's no counterbalance. There's nothing to suck it back down.
Exactly.
And so it just builds and builds and builds. And actually, if you look in the last 30 years, so I always give this number because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in the early 1990s, about 30 years ago. In that 30 years, we've emitted more CO2 from human activities into the atmosphere than all of human history before that.
Wow. Okay.
And this comes back to those exponential increases again. This is a theme throughout all of this. Compound growth, exponential increases as the population grows exponentially, as consumption per person grows exponentially. We've seen this rising tide of CO2 emissions.
And that's exactly at the time where we've sort of realized that it's going to be a serious problem.
Yeah. So in the early 90s, we officially realized that climate change is a serious problem. But I mean, the original science was done 150 years ago. So there's actually a female scientist called Eunice Newton-Foote who first linked CO2 with temperature increases. Right. She did these experiments putting different...
But she didn't get credit for it, did she?
No. She did these experiments putting different gases in jars and looking at the temperature increase. She had to get a male colleague to present her findings at a scientific proceedings. And it was just kind of lost for 100 40 years or so,
Yeah.
that contribution just wasn't acknowledged until, ironically, a retired oil engineer dug up the papers in those scientific proceedings and gave her proper credit for it. So she was the first one to link CO2 and temperature. Then Arrhenius did the maths on that about 40 years.
He does sound like
later.
a mathematician, right?
Yeah.
Arrhenius, the mathematician.
And he did the maths on how much the world's going to warm based on the concentration increases of CO2.
Yeah.
And he did that pretty much as a distraction from his ongoing divorce.
Fair enough. Yeah.
As you
Kept
do.
himself busy. Yeah.
And so he figured that out about 100 years ago, and it was pretty close to the best computer models of today. A couple of bits wrong, but that was the fundamental basis.
Yeah.
And then there was a guy called Guy Callender, who was an English engineer, and he came along a couple of decades after Arrhenius. So this was the early 20th century, and he was the first one to say, "Hey, actually, maybe we're already increasing our human activities are already actually making a material impact on CO2."
What year was that?
I think that was 1940.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So we've known this process a good 100 years.
Yeah. But it didn't really matter in 1940, did it? Because
nobody took it seriously, because they didn't say, well, we're not going to emit that much carbon, so it's going to be a tiny little temperature difference.
And I think we actually
care about that?
We actually had quite a lot of rainforests back then as well, which was sequestering a lot of the carbon that we were releasing. So it wasn't like the scale of the problem was nowhere near it is today.
It's just the sheer volume of fossil fuels that are burned. So to net sequester CO2, you have to expand a rainforest. So if you've artificially put CO2 in the atmosphere, you need to plant more trees to take it back out.
Yeah.
And so it's these exponential increases to burning coal, oil, and gas that have really led to these huge changes that we've seen. And so the earliest climate models, so computer models, were the 1970s.
Yeah.
So Manabe's recently won a Nobel Prize for his contribution to that. And there were a handful of these very early models. And if you look at their predictions for what warming and CO2 was going to do over the course of 50 years to where we are today, they were pretty much bang on.
How do they predict that, given that they didn't really know the inputs that we have today, which didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago?
So they had the basic maths, and they essentially built basic computer models where you could divide the Earth up into little squares and predict, based on changes to CO2, you would predict how much energy would be trapped and what that would do to warming. And that's just an early form of the supercomputers that we have today that run these models,
simulation models.
Yeah.
How did you get into all this stuff? I mean, was there something like in your childhood or in your background that sort of started pushing you in this direction?
Yeah. So you want kind of like an epiphany moment,
or an inspiration moment. Like it doesn't have to be like.
Yeah. I can't give you one.
Yeah,
I can't give you one. Look,
yeah. Were you always interested though, or is it something more recent?
You know what? I obviously listen to a lot of podcasts on climate and environmental issues.
Not as good as this one, but
not as good.
Yeah, fair enough.
And everyone seems to have an epiphany moment or an inherent love of nature. Or if I'm honest with you, I've always lived in cities. I grew up in cities. Yes, I like nature. I like David Attenborough documentaries. I like going camping occasionally. Yeah. And I can understand the value of nature in itself and for humans to appreciate. But I'm certainly not a hardened environmentalist.
Fair enough.
I think the closest I get to nature on a regular basis is playing golf. Which is a fertilized monoculture of grass, right?
At least you're honest about it.
Yeah. Well, you have to be. We're all climate hypocrites in some way. But no, I'm interested in humans.
Yeah.
And what we've built, I think, is amazing.
Yeah.
So I've always been into science, and it's.
What was your PhD in? Because that was related to sustainability, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was sustainably focused. So I was working on one application was Windows. So that sounds super boring.
Yeah.
Basically,
Insulation?
putting films on windows
Okay.
that you can't see.
Yeah.
But they can either trap the heat inside the building or reflect the heat, depending on what kind of climate you're in.
Yeah.
Or even very clever ones, which the material would itself switch at a certain temperature to regulate the heat of a building.
Yeah.
So it's very clever, like passive technology. And also looking at applications, things called carbon nanotubes, and looking at uses for those in improving the efficiency of solar panels. So you've got a plate of glass on your solar panel, you can put a coating on it to try and scatter the light so it absorbs more. So
really interesting stuff, basically. Yeah.
To me, very interesting stuff. Do you know what? I just missed out on that I had. So that was my PhD or doctorate. I applied for one at Imperial, which was very, very cool. It was called metamaterials.
It does sound cool.
And these are like nanostructured materials, so like a billionth of a millimeter.
Graphene and stuff like that.
Yeah. So these are tiny microstructured or nanostructured surfaces that can bend light the wrong way.
Okay.
So kind of, when light goes through a glass, it bends one way, they can bend it the other way.
Okay. Yeah.
Sort of simple terms.
Yeah.
And so you could coat something in this and you can use it to bend the light around that object. So you can make a cloaking device.
No way. That's sick.
Yeah.
Invisibility cloak.
Yeah. So I had a look recently where they got to with it. And I think they can do it with, because I remember at the time it was all like, we're going to make Harry Potter's cloak.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's the headline in the newspaper.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I think they've been able to do it with infrared light. So kind of like heat light, but not visible light yet.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure they'll figure it out eventually.
Yeah, but great.
Yeah.
But I missed out on that, but maybe fortuitously, because it's led me down the sort of path towards climate change, I guess.
So is that what hooked you, like the potential of like becoming invisible?
No, I mean, what hooked me on climate, what sort of led me to climate was that, we had this big problem which could materially impact the quality of life of humans all over the world. Right. It's a big...
And you dive straight into the climate industry, right?
The 10-year detour in finance, right?
Yeah.
So that's my switch to the dark side.
Fair enough.
But yeah, after 15 years in education, well, you've got to go and do something, don't you?
You avoided the real world long enough.
Yeah, you've got to go in the real world, and there's nothing more real, or maybe not real, than finance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I ended up at a big investment bank, working on the equity research team.
Nice.
In chemicals.
Nice.
So I kept the chemistry, the material science thing going. And for those who don't know, equity research, which is probably a lot, is essentially you cover a load of listed companies and you look at what they're doing in terms of market share, new technologies, commercial strategy, finances, operations, and you try and forecast how much money they're going to make. And then you take all those future cash flows and you put a value on the company.
And were you good at
What's
that?
the share price worth?
Could you figure out what the share price would be in a couple of years?
So it's a tough game. No one can perfectly beat the market, or you'd have one very mega rich individual.
Exactly.
It's about getting it right more than you get it wrong.
Fair enough.
Which we did, yeah. But I kept the focus on climate, on sort of new energy throughout my time at the bank, really.
How did you manage that? So did you just factor in like their emissions in your reports? Is that?
So 10 years ago, if I'd tried to say, hey, we're going to put this company's emissions in a report, I would have been laughed out the bank, right? That just didn't happen.
Yeah.
But what I did make sure is that I was covering all the companies that did the new energy technology.
Got it.
So the chemical companies manufacturing the polysilicon to make solar panels.
Yeah.
Companies making the materials that go into batteries for electric cars.
Yeah.
Companies making the enzymes that turn biofuel, that turn biological corn or waste materials into ethanol or fuel. So I made sure that that was my sort of USP, my area, and I became more and more involved, orchestrating basically sort of value chain reports. So I didn't just want to be stuck on this one component of these, the chemistry bit of the whole thing. I wanted to learn about the panels, solar panels, as well as the polysilicon that makes the panels, as well as the mining that's involved in the whole thing. So from the start to the finish, what does the whole value chain look like? What does the whole supply chain look like?
Yeah.
And so I sort of took it upon myself to orchestrate big thematic reports, and I pulled in all the information from analysts all over the bank, and would try and figure out, well, what's the future of the car industry?
Yeah.
From metals and mining through to materials, through to components, through to cars, through to automation.
Yeah.
What's this going to look like? What does everybody think? Can we build a model that connects all of this
That's
together?
amazing. Yeah.
And can we figure out what are the value add bits of this? Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? When's oil going to peak?
And your book is kind of like that as well, right? Like you've pulled information and data from like hundreds of sources, and you've sort of compiled it into this one concise, almost like dictionary for climate science.
Yeah. Well, so what I wanted to do, so I got to a point where I'd been writing these reports, and I just kept knocking heads with senior managing directors in the bank, usually in the oil and gas team. And I would say, look, electric cars, we're going to see, everyone's very bullish on them apart from you guys. We're going to see peak oil at some point over the next decade, because oil is primarily used for transport. And they were not having it. They were like, nope, oil's not going to peak. It's going to keep growing. You can't write that.
Yeah.
And an argument would ensue. They'd probably win because they're senior and they pull in more money than me. And so that became frustrating to me. So there was that kind of thread of frustration and not being able to write exactly what I wanted and model and work out exactly what I wanted. And on the other hand, I was thinking about going to a climate-focused fund or trying to make a difference in that way, deploying money into climate solutions. And so I was reading around the subject a lot.
Silicon Valley Bank has some openings if you're interested.
I'll probably steer clear of that one.
But that's an interesting one, right? Because SVB was one of the biggest lenders to sustainable startups and early stage companies. And, this weekend we heard that they've gone under in a very serious way.
Yeah.
Do you think like the banking industry is complicit in the climate disaster that we're going through right now?
Gosh, that's a hard question.
Because the answer is yes, or because
no. Do you know what? I just think there was certainly 5 years ago, before I left, I think the attitude within finance regarding net zero and climate change was, it's too long term, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Or it's too expensive, doesn't work, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
I always think within finance, there's this kind of culture of almost preserving the status quo. So to look intelligent, you have to be cynical of anything ever changing, of new stuff.
So there are a bunch of hedgehogs or foxes, foxes pretending to be hedgehogs.
Well, they're hedgehogs pretending to be foxes.
Hedgehogs pretending to be foxes, fair enough.
So they have one view of the world. They don't really think it's going to change. Everything's the same as it was last time.
Yeah.
But they wrap it up in fancy reports.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of people are very good.
Greenwashing. Yep.
A lot of people are very good in finance.
I can imagine.
Sorry, that's
sure.
That's very cynical of me.
But the ethos of the organization itself
that ethos was always, it was always, erring towards things aren't going to change.
Yeah.
Whereas my view has always been, well, I think things have to change, and I think at some point the world has to realize that.
And is that thanks to governments, like all the regulations that are coming in, especially like from the EU and from here in the UK as well? Is that forcing companies and forcing banks to begin cleaning up their act?
It is, yeah. But I think if you take a step back, and I think there's been a material change in attitudes towards climate in the last 5 years. I think a lot of that has been born out of grassroots activism.
Yeah.
I actually think
are you part of any activist groups?
I'm not, but I value what they do. They walk a difficult line, I would say.
It's too hard to do from the golf course, right?
Sorry. If I lie down on the 9th hole, they're going to pick me up and throw me on the road.
Yeah.
Look, I think they've got to walk the line of getting as much media attention for the cause as possible, but you have to keep the public on side, right?
Right.
And that's
which they failed at times, right?
Yeah. I think Extinction Rebellion maybe can push it too far.
Yeah.
And start to alienate the general public.
But I guess that's why we're even talking about them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they've gone too far.
But I think what's really worked is like Sunrise Movement.
Okay, there you go.
Youth movements, I think have been more successful in that. I guess they're going down new channels, like Instagram and social media and all of this stuff, and creating that cultural movement in that way.
Yeah.
Which, naturally, the whole point of it is to get followers.
Yeah.
And they get followers following this, this climate activism. I think that's been really powerful. Yeah. And I think that in turn has woken up politicians, because as soon as you can see you're going to start to lose votes, then you quickly change your attitude. And then I think, corporations and finance have had to get on board. Yes, I think finance has to play a huge role in this, because we could go down the route of governments raising taxes, taxing us all more, raising taxes, coming up with a central plan for how we get to net zero, and deploying the money. But I think the 20th century told us that doesn't work, right?
What do you think about like the B Corp movement? Do you think that's having a material impact? Yeah,
I think so you got B Corp. For me, you've got the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is the sort of foundation of carbon accounting for companies. So
right.
I work with companies doing carbon footprinting and net zero strategies. And you've then got organizations like science-based targets.
Mm-hmm.
So these are telling companies and telling financial institutions exactly how they need to cut emissions, at what rate, to be aligned with 1.5 degrees and net zero. And then you've got things like TCFD, which is founded by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, which is trying to instill an understanding of climate risk within finance and within corporations.
Nice.
So they have to, it's forcing them to evaluate, what happens if we get more storms, more flooding, more heat waves, more forest fires. How's that going to impact our business? But also, what are the opportunities from the energy transition as we go from brown to green? How can we play a role in that and identify that? So getting companies and getting financial institutions thinking about not only minimizing risk, but also maximizing opportunities and accelerating change. And what I would say is, from the companies that I've worked with on this, a lot of them, the pressure for them to start reporting on emissions or to put a decarbonization net zero plan in place, a lot of the pressure is coming from shareholders.
Oh, really? Wow.
If the CEOs listen to their shareholders, and shareholders are starting to push this agenda.
And that's a form of activism as well, right? When like a group of shareholders basically sues the company that they're invested in for not meeting net zero targets.
It is, yeah. And it doesn't have to be as extreme as suing. It could be just an email, a phone call, a conversation saying, hey, we're your largest shareholder. we want you to disclose
Yeah,
climate risk.
they're just
and climate
typically
emissions.
not the largest shareholder. I think, and I think that's why they need to resort to like more extreme measures than
I
an
think
email.
you're talking about activist investors who would typically
Yeah.
buy a chunk, try and get a seat on the board, and try and push some change in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we are seeing more of that as well. But
Super
broadly,
interesting.
this has
Wasn't
to
the Shell board recently sued by one of those groups?
the
The individual board members.
that's ongoing.
What's that about?
Is it Shell or Exxon? So I probably don't want to get into that, to be honest. I don't know enough about it.
Are you on that board? So you were in the banking system, and you were trying to incorporate these new values and trying to sort of bring in this fresh thinking.
Yeah.
But the big wigs with the cigars said, not happening.
Oh, you've forgotten the top hats.
And the top hats, exactly. What prompted you to leave banking, and what was the new path that you embarked on?
Yeah, so I was sort of clashing over this. I sort of found my niche in building these big sort of integrated models. And I'd been reading around climate because I wanted to go to maybe a climate focused fund or something. And I realized there wasn't really a book out there that gave me all the answers that I wanted.
A book
Or a resource or anything that just had everything I needed to know in one, integrated and added up properly. Yeah. And so that's what I decided to do. So I quit the bank and set about writing this book.
Which obviously paid a lot better than what you did earlier.
If you want to make money, don't write a book. That's all I'm going to say. No, so
tell J.K. Rowling that. But fair enough.
That was 2019. Obviously, COVID hit about 6 months, a year later. So that definitely slowed down progress. So I was, looking after the kids at home.
Yeah.
But eventually got the book written, and it covers the science of climate change. Yeah. An impartial assessment of the technological solutions. Yeah. And the science. So, the whole point of this book was to be impartial. I didn't take one side or the other going into it. I just tried to look at everything and take the most logical path forward. Yeah. And then, so it's science, technology, economics, add everything up and look how it interacts with the economy, and politics. Yeah. So kind of how do you, even if you know the best course forward, how do you make it happen? And what has been happening.
Yeah. And that's called Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero.
Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero. So where I'm not an expert in any one of those fields. I'm a kind of jack of all trades, but I think that's what was missing. Yeah. So, I've sort of started a consultancy business on the back of it, and
good plug. Yeah.
Thank you. And the basic pillars of this are knowledge building. Yep. Because I think there's a big knowledge gap between experts and the general public. Fostering collaboration, because once you start reading through all this, you realize that the economists aren't really talking to the physical scientists, who aren't maybe properly talking to the computational modelers, nobody's talking to the politicians. Maybe they don't want to,
probably for good reason.
So everybody has their little niche, their if you like, their hammer. I think that's always a good phrase, that we spend our career crafting this beautiful hammer. Yeah. Really specializing in something.
The hedgehog hammer.
The hedgehog hammer. Yeah. And when you're a hedgehog holding a hammer, every problem you see is a nail. Sure. So you just hit it. Yeah. When actually some problems are screws or bolts, and you need screwdrivers and wrenches or what have you.
So a couple of weeks ago, we went to basically question time with the mayor. And one of the biggest problems that people were upset about, and very upset about, is the expansion of the ULEZ zone. Yes. So for people who don't know, ULEZ is the
ultra low emission zone.
It's basically a zone in London where the most polluting vehicles have to pay a daily fee to basically enter. Right?
Yeah. So it's free for full electric cars. If you've got an old diesel, you've got to pay a lot.
But it almost seems like the backlash of that was pretty significant. There was protesters outside, and we didn't even know it was an issue because it doesn't really affect us. But do you think that's an example of a hedgehog with a hammer, like trying to hammer ULEZ on everyone to reduce emissions, or do you think it actually works?
That's a tricky one. I think it's a positive change.
Yeah,
And I used to live in London, and London used to have some pretty bad air pollution.
fair.
And I know you've experienced bad air pollution
In Asia,
across
yeah,
all over the world,
yeah,
and particularly
exactly.
in Asia. India has, and China have very bad air pollution problems.
Yeah, for sure.
That's something we haven't touched on yet, but that's,
Yeah,
air pollution is the second biggest cause of risk factor leading to death in the world. So about 8 million people per year due to indoor and outdoor air pollution. And 90% of that is caused by burning fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So that's a big co-benefit of solving climate change is eliminating air pollution and all of those deaths.
Yeah.
And that's something that's often forgotten or not spoken about.
So ULEZ, yay or nay?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But you've got to do it in a way that brings people on board, which I guess what this meeting was for, right? You can see the problem. If you've got an old diesel car and you live in the area and suddenly you're stuck.
Yeah.
And you can't afford to change the car.
I guess some people, like, their opinion was that their businesses would then be in ULEZ zones, which would dissuade people coming from outside London to do business with them because their vans and their delivery vehicles wouldn't be allowed, or they'd have to pay like the £15 a day.
Yeah. It's tricky. But I always think where you have these regulations, you need both carrot and stick.
Yeah.
So that's obviously stick. You got to pay a fine if you're driving a polluting car. Couple that with some carrot. Have some sort of scrappage scheme,
which they do. I think
you can hand in your old diesel, get money for it, and upgrade to a.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a very good deal, but I think there are.
And you have to have consultation periods, of course, which are why these meetings go on.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But there's where there's change, there's always going to be issues, and you're always going to have division. Which actually brings me back to my third pillar of my business, which was bridging the divide on climate. So exactly these kind of problems. Yeah. So it's obviously a very divisive topic, and it's been really politicized, of course, in the US particularly. Yeah. Less so in the UK. But one of the main conclusions of my book is that we can't perfectly predict the future. We don't know exactly how bad this is going to be. Yeah. You put in a certain set of assumptions, it could be very, very bad. That creates lots of warming and lots of knock-on damages, which are going to plunge us back into the Malthusian trap. Yeah. Also, you can put in a load of assumptions where the sensitivity to warming is not so high, that the future damages are not so big, that we're able to adapt more easily. Yeah. And you only get a small bit of damage, and we still keep on improving quality of life, and it just has a little knock. So, and that's where a lot of arguments now hang on climate change, I think, on the economics and the damages in the future. But my kind of point from the book was, well, actually, if you go on to look at solutions and look at deploying net zero as a solution, so eliminating those emissions as far as we can, actually, if you look at the way that a net zero system is evolving, and you run its course through your model as it scales up and gets cheaper, then actually that net zero system is going to be cheaper than the equivalent fossil fuel system. So you can solve climate change. You can also solve air pollution, which is a big co-benefit. And you can end up with a cheaper system, which is more reliable, more equitable, and more secure than what we have today. Yeah. And so the fundamental message for me is net zero is not economy or environment. It's a win-win for both the economy and the environment. Yeah. So, it's going to accelerate GDP growth, create a more resilient global economy, and avoid all of the damaging impacts of climate change and air pollution.
On the topic of transport, one of the biggest criticisms of electric vehicles is the huge amount of mining and rare earth elements that are required to actually power these batteries. Do you think that net over the life of the car, do they actually prove to be more advantageous than a typical gasoline vehicle?
They hands down absolutely are in terms of CO2 emissions. So, of course, from the tailpipe of the car, of an electric car,
Yeah, that's
no
that's the
CO2.
obvious one.
Then
But
the
that's what I'm saying, like,
next query
what about,
would
like,
be,
the net?
okay, but what if you charge it from the grid, which is powered by coal and
Coal,
gas?
exactly.
Even then, on the average grid, it's still emitting less CO2 because electric cars are 3 times more efficient than
Yeah.
combustion engines.
But my question is a bit broader than just the emission of the car itself.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the emissions of the entire process of mining
Yeah.
till the end when the car is disposed.
Oh, yeah. So then we can add in the, let's say the emissions from the production of the car.
Yeah.
So you're putting in half a ton of battery into a long range electric vehicle. That's going to add about 4 or 5 tons of CO2 to the production process of the vehicle.
Yeah.
But you save about a ton a year of CO2 driving the car. So after 4 or 5 years, you're net saving on emissions.
So you're saying the upfront emissions of an electric car is significantly higher than
It's 4 to 5 tons higher.
Wow.
But you save that over 4 years.
Where are those emissions coming from? Like the initial 4 or 5 tons of
It's
emissions?
extraction and processing of all the materials that go into making the battery.
Yeah. Tesla announced a new paradigm in manufacturing this week, which used no rare earth elements. I don't know if you read about this. You probably did because you read about this stuff. Any insights on that?
Yes, I mean, yeah. And your original question was asking about rare earth elements and
Yeah.
mining as well.
Yeah.
So of course, mining is another. So to make that battery, half a ton battery, you're probably extracting about 15 tons of ore, rock,
Yeah.
from the Earth's crust, or wherever the metal's sourced from.
Yeah.
Because it's only a small percentage of that ore which you actually can use. But of course, if you're driving a gasoline car, you're using about a ton of oil every year.
Yeah.
The car lasts for about 15 years. That's about 15 tons. So in terms of mining, they're pretty equivalent. Though obviously different sources,
Yeah.
different techniques.
But just to play devil's advocate, I would argue that like the life of the EV battery also depreciates accordingly. So you can't actually get 15 years out of it.
You will get 15 years out of an
You think so?
EV. Yeah, yeah. So you lose about maybe 1% per year range. So your 15-year-old car will have 15% less range. So your very fast chargers on the motorway, if that's your primary charging mechanism, or if you charge it to 100% and deplete it to near zero, that's going to degrade the battery very quickly.
Got it. Okay.
But if you cycle 20 to 80%
Yeah.
charge, and you do most of your charging on slower chargers,
Yep.
and then you just do the supercharging on long journeys, which we make a few times a year, your battery will lose about 1% range per year.
Yeah. So you drive a Tesla.
I drive a Tesla and I've had no range loss in 3 years,
Yeah. And
4 years.
so, but do you feel like when you charge your car, are you taking that energy from the grid? Like, how have you set yourself up?
So partially. So we actually have 50 solar panels on the back of the house.
Oh, that's very cool.
So that provides about half our electricity needs for the year. So that runs for about half the year. It runs the house, all the appliances, lighting,
Completely,
et cetera,
like
in the house.
100%?
Yes. So
That's
we also have a
amazing.
Powerwall 2 battery pack on the side of the house.
What's that?
So that stores the solar energy in a battery. Because you get all your solar kind of peaks in the middle of the day. You'll get high output in the middle of the day, which you won't use all of it. You'll only use a fraction of it.
Yeah.
So the extra output, instead of going back into the grid, goes into our battery and is stored for the evening and overnight and early morning.
Yeah.
And then it gets topped back up again.
Fair enough.
So it's a nice sort of standalone system.
Yeah, but that's amazing. So your electric car is being charged through solar. So you're
I mean, it's once I got it, so once you got the infrastructure set up, it is amazing because literally the sun shining on my back roof is powering my house. It's heating my swimming pool. So we've got a heat pump on the swimming pool, which we run purely off the solar.
Yeah.
So we only run the pool when it's 5 months of the year when it's warm and sunny.
Yeah.
And then there's enough left over to pretty much charge 2 electric cars for 5 months of the year or so. So it's quite phenomenal that the sun can do that.
Yeah.
You run all of these numbers on a computer or you read about them, and it's okay. But when you actually have it working in your own system, it is quite amazing.
Yeah.
And those solar panels were put on, if you work out the cost of them, that electricity is costing us over the life of the system about 14 pence per kilowatt hour.
Okay.
Compared to grid electricity in the UK is about 35p at the moment.
Wow.
So I'm not even paying a premium for this, right?
But you are paying a pretty high upfront cost, right?
Upfront cost, yeah.
Which
in
your case was £30,000, was it something like that?
It was about £20,000 for the
£20,000
panels and the battery.
And that depreciates over what
So solar
period?
panels will last 25 years.
I was thinking about that.
35
yeah,
years.
but do you feel like you'll be tempted to replace them in 10 years when like there's a new technology out, or?
I don't need to. I have enough energy.
Fair enough. That's a good point.
So they just stay there. You have to replace the inverter, which is like the power equipment.
How often?
After about 15 years.
Okay.
And then potentially replace the battery after maybe 15 years as well.
Yeah.
But even if you factor replacing costs in, it works out at 14 pence per kilowatt hour. So
yeah,
before the energy crisis, that was pretty much the price of electricity in the UK.
That is amazing. And I love the setup you have here. For the average household, what proportion of our emissions actually come from energy usage, and what proportion comes from just like day-to-day living, like groceries and holidays and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I would be hesitant to split it up in that way. Sometimes you see reports and they have electricity as a chunk, and then...
No, I'm just thinking about it because you've sort of almost now managed the energy side of things, right? Your energy is more or less sustainable.
Yeah.
But there's still a chunk that is left over. So I'm just wondering, like, what's the net effect of having a net zero home?
Everything's intrinsically linked to energy. Yeah. So I wouldn't lump energy into one category and everything else over there. What I would say is that, broadly speaking, you look at global emissions, it's roughly evenly split between transport, so driving, planes, trucks, industry, so all of the goods that we consume, agriculture, food, and then buildings, so like heating, cooling, lighting, cooking. So it's roughly evenly spread across those 4.
So in your book you write, in the end, it's the balance of fear which has stopped humanity from transitioning away from fossil fuels. What are the major hurdles holding back change today? And what's a key idea in your book that maybe you want to share with the listeners today?
So when I say fear, it's fearing the changes that we have to make. And I don't think the changes that we have to make are actually that radical.
Right.
We need to deploy wind, solar, renewable electricity 5 times faster.
Yeah.
So electricity has to go from maybe 20% of all energy to the majority of all energy. So we're powering everything with this renewable system, low carbon renewable system. And then
what are the percentages today in the UK, for example?
So globally, electricity is about 20% of all energy.
Electricity? What do you mean?
So electricity is 20% of all energy.
Electricity is 20% of all energy. Okay.
Yes. So this is something people often don't pick up on.
Yeah.
Is that the share of electricity has to grow. Okay.
Compared to?
Because what else have you got? You've got oil that's burnt in vehicles.
Okay.
You've got gas and coal that's used for heating homes or heating industrial processes. Right. All of that has to be electricity, or mostly.
Okay.
So you've got to grow that share of electricity, and it's got to be powered by renewables generation. Then of course you have to switch the demand side. So the way we use energy today has to become basically electrified. So electrify everything that we can. And then there are a handful of other solutions, things like hydrogen, carbon capture, biofuels, which will work sort of round the edges where electrification is too difficult. But I mean, that basically just means switching from a gas car to an electric car. Instead of using an oil burner or gas boiler in your house, you use a heat pump, which runs on electricity. And industrial processes need to be electrified, which means instead of burning coal or gas for heat, you use electric heating. So that might be a heat pump, or it might be resistive heating or microwave, whatever works and is most efficient.
What's the actual cost of moving to a net zero economy?
So if you're talking about the investment cost, so over the next 2 or 3 decades, if we go from where we are today to net zero, the cost's going to be about $70 trillion.
70
trillion dollars, about $3.5 trillion we need to spend per year on energy supply and on those electrification items like building all the batteries that we need and heat pumps that we need. And so that's
and just to compare that, like, what would be the cost of not doing anything?
So the cost of not doing anything, just investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, which we already have been in the past, that would cost something like 30-40 trillion over that period.
So it would be cheaper to not do anything?
It would be 30 to 40 trillion dollars cheaper in investment costs.
Yeah.
But if you deploy net zero, the running costs become 25% cheaper.
Okay. So
you're starting to get paid back.
Yeah.
And if you add it all up over the course of the transition, it's roughly a 10-year payback. And then you start to make money on it. So yes, again, everything costs more upfront for net zero.
Yeah.
But the running costs will be lower.
Yeah.
So on my numbers, if you deployed net zero technology today at scale, and costs didn't change, the whole thing would be more expensive.
Yeah.
But what happens is the more solar panels you make, the cheaper they get. The more wind turbines you build, the cheaper they get. So every time solar has doubled, solar installs, the prices come down 20%. Every time wind turbine installs have doubled, the prices come down 10%. Every time we've doubled the amount of batteries made, the prices come down 30%.
Yeah.
So if you look at taking net zero solutions from a few percent of the whole system today, they're going to have to double roughly another 5 times over.
Yeah.
And get to a majority solution. So wind and solar. And that means the price comes down substantially following that learning curve, it's called.
So you're saying that as we deploy more solar, as we deploy more wind, the price continues to drop. But economically, is that a good thing? Does it disincentivize people from investing in the infrastructure?
Cost of the install.
Yeah.
So to produce the panels and install them.
Exactly.
It's getting cheaper and cheaper. And that means the price of the electricity that they generate gets cheaper and cheaper.
Okay.
So that's the reason that today I can put solar panels on my house and achieve a competitive price of electricity per unit with what I would pay from buying it from the grid.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking about it from the perspective of the provider. So let's say there was a provider that was completely renewable.
Yeah.
When those prices drop, does that mean their revenues would drop over time, or? No,
it means that they can outcompete coal, oil, and gas.
So we have Octopus Energy at home.
Yeah.
And they claim to be a renewable provider.
Yeah.
And we thought that, okay, now, we're in this massive gas crises and all these prices are going up. So our prices should technically stay the same, right?
Yeah.
But they're not. They're actually going up in proportion to everyone else's.
So that's nothing.
So we emailed them and we said, why is this happening? And the response we got was that the price of energy is regulated, or it's set at a certain level.
Yeah.
And everyone follows the same level.
Yeah.
So even though they're still producing energy far cheaper than they're selling it, And there's no
So
advantages coming to us.
it's called marginal pricing. So you can imagine there's, you've got wind and solar generation. You've also got natural gas, maybe coal, electricity generation. And what they do is they basically bid into a market. You know how much electricity roughly you're going to need. So you pick the cheapest first, then the next cheapest, then the next cheapest, up until the most expensive that fills your needs. And then the price for all of those suppliers is set at the most expensive. So the problem is that the electricity prices in the UK are being set off the price of gas, electricity,
Which is crazy.
which has become incredibly expensive because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Which means that any potential cost saving to the consumer is just getting eaten up.
Yeah, that is the issue, and this is to do with the way electricity markets work. So they have to be sort of semi-regulated, because everybody needs to keep the lights on, basically, and there has to be backup capacity in case demand suddenly spikes or something goes out, something goes wrong, or there's adverse weather. So electricity markets are heavily regulated in that way, but they're maybe not ideally designed for, exactly as you say, I'm on a renewable tariff. I feel like I should just be paying that cost of generation, which hasn't changed because it's not impacted by the gas price. And they are looking at reforming electricity markets and maybe splitting it out into different pools that would trade individually. But you've got to think that overall, if and in the UK, about 30% of electricity generation comes from wind and solar.
Nice.
If that hadn't been there, then the price of electricity would be even more expensive.
Right.
Because we would have had to go up to even more expensive gas or potentially coal fired power plants. And they would set the price even higher.
So a renewable provider that's producing a kilowatt of energy gets paid the same as the oil and gas company?
So renewables, so solar farms, wind farms have made a lot of money where expensive gas electricity has been setting the price.
Yeah, which is great.
Which you hope those companies then take those cash flows and invest into even more wind and solar.
Yeah. So you have a pretty interesting blog where you write about your net zero life, and on that blog you have an index of companies, right, which you call the Net Zero 90. Can you tell us a little bit more about them and what makes them special?
Yeah, so this is really just putting my my old investment analyst hat on.
Yeah.
And going out there and trying to find companies that I think are going to have real impact on the climate crisis. So over the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen massive fund inflows into ESG funds. So that's environment, social, and governance managed funds, which look to invest only in companies that meet certain criteria on those different elements. The problem is, if you look into those funds, usually if you buy into them, you just end up owning a load of healthcare or technology stocks.
Right.
You're not really investing in companies which are having a meaningful impact on climate change. Right. So there's a kind of a movement out there looking beyond ESG, which is great. You should invest in companies which are well managed on all of those elements. But if you want to go beyond that and you want to put your money to work into companies who are making actually a real impact on the issue that matters to you, that's more impact investing. And so really, I was just screening through all of the companies out there which are doing meaningful things on climate change using a set of criteria which I believe will mean that they make a material difference.
Yeah.
That actually it's sustainable but also scalable. So there's no point having a really green business model if you can't scale it and make a big impact. And to scale it and make a big impact, that means you have to fit into capital markets somewhere, you have to provide a good or a service which people are going to want.
Yeah.
And can be economically competitive or has some sort of X factor.
Are these UK-based companies, or is it a global index?
Global companies, yeah.
And how is that performed compared to like the S&P 500 or?
So I mean, at the minute, I'm just writing about the companies. So this is
you don't actually
in no way investment advice or anything like that. I'm just profiling companies which I think are great,
and that's fine.
But not, I don't touch on valuation or anything like that. Yeah. So like, within this portfolio of companies that I'm looking at, I'm just trying to find companies which I think can make a meaningful change, a meaningful impact on climate change, and can scale significantly, and drive value in that way. And looking across all aspects of what we've been talking about today in the net zero transition, really. So everything from energy supply, so renewables companies providing the electricity generation, but also companies who are going to be involved in building out the transmission and distribution. Yeah. So that means if we're going to triple, quadruple electricity, then that means more power lines, more grid, more distribution centers. And so the companies who are going to be involved in that, and the grid's going to go from a sort of centralized, big power plants pushing energy into our homes to become more decentralized, where power is going to be going back and forward. So we're going to have some rooftop generation going back into the grid. We're going to have demand management. So maybe when there's a big peak in demand, maybe we have the Internet of Things, which is connecting all our appliances, can say, hey, maybe turn down the air conditioning, turn off this fridge for 5 minutes, and we can reduce this demand and help balance the electricity grid, or pull some power from the car. So, are there companies within the digital space which are enabling that? So that's kind of on the supply side. Then obviously the demand side, you've got the value chains for electric vehicles, trucks, planes, ships. You've got industrial heat and how that's going to be transformed from fossil fuels to electricity. Yeah. And all the companies that are sort of playing around the edges of that as well.
So obviously we're going through a major cost of living crisis, right, here in the UK. And most people don't have the capital to deploy like massive solar rigs or batteries or any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Are there places where like an average consumer can save money today by being more renewable?
Yes. Yes. This is a great question. And, we've been talking about what I've kind of done around the house. And you mentioned, kind of put solar panels and a battery on the house, which is great. Awesome. Yeah. But it's cost me £20,000 up front. And of course, a lot of people don't have £20,000 up front, or aren't sure that they're going to be in the house for that long, or aren't sure that they'll recoup the value if they sell the house. Yep. I get that. Yep. What can you do? Well, you can switch to Octopus Energy. You talked about all these. There are plenty of 100% renewable suppliers, which are guaranteeing that the electricity that you use, that they've sourced from renewable sources. Yeah. And yes, that doesn't build directly a new solar farm or a new wind turbine, but indirectly it sends a signal to the market to say consumers are going renewable. Yeah. You need to push more renewables because we need more of these 100% renewable tariffs.
Yeah, which is great. But again, there's no real cost saving for the consumer, right?
No.
That's the problem.
But then if you look at other things that I've done around the house, so insulation. Yeah. So it's not a very sexy topic. No. But it is incredibly important. So, insulation and energy efficiency in general, it's never going to completely solve the crisis if you're still burning fossil fuels, but it buys time. Right. And it enables the transition. So
how does insulating your home help with energy usage?
So it's gonna, if you're not losing heat from your house, then you need less heat to heat it, right? So it's reducing consumption.
What happens during the heat waves though? Does that mean your home is going to be even hotter during those periods?
No, it keeps your home at a more constant temperature. So
that's
your home will be cooler in a heat wave.
Fair enough, yeah.
It just stops the movement of heat both in and out.
And again, this is a place where the government has come in and said, we're offering subsidies, we're offering...
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that anybody should do, and I mean anybody, even if you're renting a house,
Yeah.
is roll out some insulation in your loft.
Yeah.
It'll cost you maybe a couple of £100 at most.
Yeah.
But for an uninsulated house, about 30% of heat is lost through the roof.
Fair. Yeah.
So, even if you're a tenant, and this is a classic sort of problem, rent-a-tenant problem.
Yeah.
Why should I pay to do something when I don't own the house?
Exactly. Yeah.
But even if you spend £100 rolling out that insulation, you would save that within the year.
Yeah.
Within the first winter. So there are things that are incredibly cheap that will instantly save you money and will help reduce energy consumption now and enable the net zero transition. And what I mean by that is eventually you're not going to have a gas boiler in your house, you're going to have a heat pump in your house.
Right.
And heat pumps they're a really efficient technology.
Yeah.
So 1 unit of electricity into a heat pump, you get 3 units of heat back out.
Right.
Compare that to a gas boiler. If you put 1 unit of gas energy in, you get less than 1 unit of gas heat back out. So 3 times more efficient, but they like to work at lower temperatures through your radiators. For instance, we mostly heat our house with radiators in the UK.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have the temperature, the radiators set to a lower temperature, about 45 degrees instead of 60, then you want your house to be better insulated because it makes that heat pump even more efficient.
And again, the heat pump also has a higher upfront cost compared to a regular boiler or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this is about, heat pumps are they're going to be a difficult, especially here in the UK, I think they're going to be a difficult sort of transition priority, but they have to happen.
Yeah.
And so the government at the moment here in the UK gives you a £5,000 grant, free money.
Yeah.
If you install a heat pump system, which makes
what do they cost?
Probably costs about £10,000 versus a boiler, which would be about £5,000. So it makes it about equivalent cost.
Fair enough. Yeah.
The running costs of a heat pump compared to a gas boiler here in the UK probably about the same because they depend on the price of gas and electricity.
Okay.
So here in the UK, gas is about 10p per kilowatt hour. Electricity is about 30p per kilowatt hour. So electricity is 3 times more expensive. Heat pumps run on electricity, but heat pumps are 3 times more efficient. So they're roughly the same running cost.
Yeah.
But again, this is another element where really the government need to step in. So they've given some carrot there. They've given that £5,000 to make the install costs the same.
Yeah.
They could also make the running costs better for heat pumps because the way that taxes are put on energy at the moment means that there's a substantial portion of that 30 pence for electricity, which is government tax.
Oh, really?
Which is not on gas.
Yeah.
So you could take the tax off the electricity, put it on the gas, and make the running costs cheaper for electrified an electrified economy.
So it's interesting. It sounds like in both these cases, the government is disincentivizing consumers from moving to renewables because you're not getting any advantages from moving to a renewable energy provider. You're not getting any advantages of moving to a heat pump from a regular gas boiler. So what are they thinking? Like, what's going on here?
Well, that's where these market structures and taxation need to be redesigned, basically.
Yeah.
So then they in a net zero future, basically as much as we possibly can, everything has to be electrified.
Yeah.
Therefore, take your taxes off electricity and you put them on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
You incentivize the use of electricity, disincentivize the use of fossil fuels.
Well, what's preventing them from doing that? Is it just like
established
oil and gas lobbies?
No, established market structures, right?
Yeah.
Change is difficult. It's back to your low emission zone.
Yeah.
It disadvantages certain people who maybe can't afford to switch to a heat pump now, or they've just installed a gas boiler. So these things have to happen over time. So I think really creating change has to be around governments giving good direction to consumers.
Yep.
So again, I think what they need to do, coming back to the heat pumps, is they need to say, hey, well, by 2030, 2035, we're not going to allow the sale of gas boilers
Right.
in the UK anymore, which is kind of what's happened with electric cars, right? So, the government essentially said, we're going to phase out fossil fuel cars.
Yeah.
So you as a consumer sit here today and you think, well, okay, I could get a heat pump. And actually, we're not going to be allowed to have gas boilers at some point in the future. So I might as well go and do it now.
Exactly.
Plus I get £5,000 up front. Oh, plus look, the government have just made electricity cheaper than gas. So my install costs are the same. My running costs are less, and it's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
Bam, bam, bam. There's the change.
Yeah.
And the final piece is information, because a lot of people just don't know what a heat pump is, how it works, will it work in their house? There's a lot of disinformation out there.
Yep.
Not only with consumers, but also with installers. So, all of the installers are trained up for gas boilers, and they don't know how to, or they don't trust the new technology.
So we're going to have to retrain.
Which isn't actually a new technology. It's very common in commercial properties, but for residential uses. So I think, the heat pump is a real, it might not sound that exciting, but it's a good case study for a lot of the hurdles that are involved in net zero.
Yeah.
And maybe the heat pump is where the electric car was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
You had all of these sort of myths circling around. You had a lack of trust.
Yeah.
You had confusion. It was more expensive. Hadn't got the costs down so much at that point. There wasn't so much choice or performance. But hopefully we can move in that direction across all elements that we need to.
But I guess someone's got to make the heat pump sexy, right? Because without Tesla, nobody wanted those awful electric cars.
Yeah,
right? They were truly horrendous. But I don't know. Can you make heat pump sexy? Is there like a...
Well, this is what you either have to make something cheaper, and people have to care about it being cheaper.
Yeah.
Because there are some things that we just buy and we don't really care how much we spend.
Fair enough.
Especially here in the UK, right?
Yep.
I think coffee is a good example. You've been talking a lot about coffee today.
Yeah.
We spend a crazy amount of money on coffee.
Yep.
But it's just one of those things.
I guess it almost feels like a micropayments. You never truly realize how much you're spending.
Exactly.
Though there are some like YouTube gurus who would never go to Starbucks because they've sort of calculated like the long-term costs of that $4 latte.
Well, if I didn't buy my $4 latte for the next 10 years and I invested it all in Tesla stock, then I could retire at the age of 30.
Which is probably true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What were we talking about? I've completely
forgotten. No idea.
Coffee, Tesla, electric car, X factor on heat pumps. Yeah. So what I was saying is, if you make a product and it's green, that's great. Mm-hmm. People are going to go, it's green. I prefer that, as long as it's either cheaper or better. So all of these products and services for net zero have to be either cheaper or better, as well as being green, if we're going to rapidly deploy them, and preferably both.
And that's a good segue into this quote, which again is on your blog. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, he says, "I believe the decarbonizing of the global economy is going to create the greatest investment opportunity of our lifetime. The next 1,000 unicorns won't be search engines or social media companies. They'll be sustainable, scalable innovators, startups that help the world decarbonize and make the energy transition affordable for all consumers." And I guess that's what he's talking about, right? So the companies that are able to create better products that are cheaper and sustainable, green, net zero, are eventually going to replace the dinosaurs in the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I think companies need to get on board with that.
So are you planning to start a company? I think it's about time.
I don't think I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I think I'm an analyst.
Find one to partner with.
I think I'm a fox.
Sure.
And I think to be an entrepreneur, you need to be a hedgehog with a big idea and a lot of drive.
I mean, I would assume it's the opposite, right? Because entrepreneurs are so they're always jumping between things, whereas you seem hedgehoggish in your focus and discipline around your subject area. But who knows?
Who knows? We'll see.
Maybe you're a foxy hedgehog.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But no, we'll see.
Yeah, fair enough. One of the biggest criticisms of like the move to net zero, especially on a global scale, is that developing economies haven't had the same opportunity to build their markets.
No, completely. So, this is climate justice, equality, equity.
Yeah.
All of these issues are huge within the space. And it was Lord Stern who wrote a very famous Stern report on climate and the transition back in, I think it was 2005. And he described it as double inequity. So the poorest countries in the world have contributed the least in terms of historic carbon emissions, next to nothing, and yet will be hit hardest by the effects of climate change because, number one, they're generally around the equator, where you'll have the most extreme heat and change. But also they have the least capacity to adapt because they don't have the financial systems, the infrastructure, insurance, government. So as climate changes and all these physical effects take place, they're going to be unable to adapt to those changes as well as the richer countries in the world.
Yeah.
So it's double inequity, and so there is a responsibility of the richer countries of the world to support those developing countries in both improving quality of life, developing, and in also addressing climate change, both in terms of helping them adapt and hopefully helping them to sort of leapfrog fossil fuels and move towards more of a net zero system. And so this is a core element of the sort of the COP meetings or the UNFCCC process, is that rich countries should help poor countries. And there's this 100 billion of climate finance that you often hear about.
Which never gets paid.
Which has never got paid. I think the best we've done is about 80%.
Sure.
But it has been upped, even though we've never got to the original target. They've now increased it a little bit. But it needs to be manyfold bigger than that.
So to wrap up, what's your advice for the foxes and what's your advice for the hedgehogs? Like, where do they need to meet to make all this possible?
Yeah, so I guess if we think about the climate debate broadly, and I don't like the term climate denier because I think people often get mislabeled with it. I think there are some people who have healthy skepticism of climate net zero arguments, and I think that's good because having a good debate is a good thing, and hopefully it helps us choose the best path forward. There are those who are disingenuous and deliberately misleading on climate science or the economics or damages or what have you, and that's not cool. Because that's not adding any value to the debate. That's just creating confusion and will ultimately lead to bad decisions. But what I think where the climate argument started out with people being skeptical of the science, that's no longer the case. If you look at the work done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the kind of gold standard, like rubber stamp, they aggregate all the scientific research and come out with a consensus. Human emissions are unequivocally warming the planet. Right. That's settled. That's done. There's too much evidence, too much data to support any other view. Now, really, the debate now has moved on to what are the damages going to be? How bad is it going to be? And how much is it going to cost to get to net zero, to solve climate change? So I think really that's where the argument has honed in on, and really that's what I think my book addresses is look, do the maths, look at how this technological change is happening with wind, solar, batteries, what have you,
Yep.
it's going to get so cheap that net zero is going to be cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent.
For sure.
And if you get to that conclusion, it doesn't really matter how big the damages are because it's going to be net better anyway.
Yep.
So you come to this conclusion that it's not a trade-off between economy and environment.
Yeah.
It's a win-win for both economy and environment. And that's the kind of key message that I want to bring the two sides of the debate together on.
Awesome.
Thanks again for joining us on this episode of Climate Story. And I'm Rishad Mehta, your host. Reach out to me with your questions or comments. And thank you again for listening. See you on the next one.